Every time a neural network fires, it consumes roughly 20% of the body's total metabolic energy to maintain a complex informational state. Standard neurobiology assumes this energy expenditure is reactive. A physical stimulus enters the senses, the brain processes the data, and the body produces a corresponding emotional state as a biological response. We can isolate the load-bearing variable of this model by looking at willpower. A person can sit in an isolated dark room and, through directed intention alone, induce a complete physiologically measurable emotional state with zero external input. This self-induced state generates the exact same physiological markers as a natural reaction, from heart rate variability to the specific release of cortisol and adrenaline. If the full physiological cascade initiates without a stimulus, the external world functions only as one possible trigger. The true authorship of the state resides within the internal architecture of the system. Emotion functions as a generative process, the execution of a stored biological program. This process requires a structural division between the conscious caller and the physical output of the body. The conscious mind issues a low-resolution semantic command. It requests a state like joy or grief, providing a conceptual goal without any technical implementation data. In response, the physical body instantly produces a perfectly balanced, hyper-specific chemical sequence with a near-zero error rate. This diagram compares the two operating models. The bottom path accounts for the bridge required to turn a vague thought into a precise chemical event. The top path collapses when we introduce willpower, providing no mechanism to initiate chemistry without an external cause. The conscious mind pilots the body as a high-level interface. It provides the direction, while the internal substrate handles the molecular execution. This gap between a vague intent and a perfect physical output proves that your consciousness is not micromanaging your internal chemistry. It is calling a pre-written routine. To understand the complexity of this routine, we have to look at the individual ions required to trigger a single feeling at the synaptic level. Sodium, or Na+, carries the primary depolarization signal down the axon of the neuron. Potassium, K+, immediately follows to restore the resting electrical potential after the cell fires. The final release of neurotransmitters across the gap is governed by calcium. K2+ acts as the mathematically precise trigger for vesicle binding. Generating a specific emotion requires these ion ratios to be perfectly balanced and targeted to exact receptor sites across billions of synapses. The biological system executes this sequence instantly. The right body state emerges without delay or perceptible error. A semantic thought like "feel happy" lacks the data to manage this molecular precision. The instruction is too simple for the complexity of the execution. The prefrontal cortex serves as the anatomical seat of conscious intent and semantic thought. This region is epistemologically blind to the body's implementation layer. It has no direct access to the machinery of the synapses. You can think a semantic thought, but you cannot consciously calculate a precise calcium threshold or address a specific receptor. This architecture reveals a total disconnect. On one side, we have conscious intent. On the other, the physical hardware. A direct command cannot cross this gap. The instruction sadness carries no chemical parameters, leaving the hardware with nothing to execute. An autonomic translation layer must exist to bridge this divide, a system that translates thought into flesh. This invisible intermediary is the Autonomic Compiler. The compiler functions as the bridge, holding the complete library of emotional states and their physical specifications. When you think a thought, the compiler translates that semantic pointer into the exact string of calcium thresholds and vesicle parameters the hardware requires. This biological system operates below the threshold of conscious access, executing complex chemical routines without the need for conscious supervision. When the conscious caller repeatedly invokes the same semantic instruction, it triggers Hebbian reinforcement. Each repeated firing strengthens the neural connections, lowering the physical activation threshold for that specific circuit. Over time, this deliberate authorship compiles into an automatic reflex. The compiler begins to run the program without an explicit command. Human character represents this current compiled state. It is a physical record of every semantic instruction the observer has repeatedly executed. Scaling this argument reveals that the human brain's compiler is actually a local instance of a much broader geometric principle. The exact same gap between information and execution exists in the deep vacuum of space. Vector field theory describes a universal information space, a geometry of definition that sits beneath the physical layer of the universe. Just as the brain requires a compiler to turn an intent into chemistry, the universe utilizes an information geometry to compile pure definition into the laws of physics. Physical constants and force ratios are the readout of this underlying space. The topology is identical. On the left, we see the biological compiler. On the right, the universal information geometry. Both serve to translate non-physical definition into physical implementation. The zero-error execution of physics at a black hole follows the exact same structural logic as the chemical execution in a human synapse. The conscious self functions as an information-theoretic lens within this architecture. This observer remains distinct from the physical substrate it pilots, operating as a localized field of intent that directs the flow of information. At every scale of this fractal system, the physical layer remains the implementation. It is never the origin point. Matter and chemistry are what universal definition looks like from the inside of a spacetime frame. You are the invoker of that definition. As a localized field of consciousness passing instructions into a physical machine, you ultimately become the state you choose to execute.